This morning told me that they said Zach was a cradle member. And I like that idea about a cradle member because this morning I got to baptize my grandson. And I've been a licensed local pastor now for about 6 months.
Amen. Amen.
And if I retire today, I'm okay. Because I baptized my grandson this morning. So I was excited about that. So the message that I'm going to do today was done by Martin Luther King. Dr. King did this message in April of 1967. And one of the things you can do nowadays, if you put in Dr. King, you can get his messages. They're all online, so you can listen to what he said. And I wanted to have a joint service and felt called for us to get together as St. Paul's and First Methodist Church to get together. And we were so blessed this morning by your choir. We had 220 people. We had the largest number that ever gotten up at 8:30 in the morning to go to church. And it was to hear you. It was not to hear me. So it was a blessing, and I appreciate that. By 1967, some of y'all probably have seen or heard about this movie, Selma, that's out. I think it's up for an Academy Award tonight. And Selma had happened in 1965. And so by 1967, when Dr. King was preaching this, he had been in prison a lot of times. He had been through, Selma was about what they call Bloody Sunday. He had been through Bloody Sunday. And he got to the point where he preached this sermon about what's life about. And he said that we need to live our lives in 3 dimensions. And one of the reasons I chose this sermon of Dr. King's to do is because my grandson was getting baptized, and I wanted to deliver a message that I don't know whether my grandson's going to be, whether I'm going to be around 25 years from now when my grandson is old enough to get this message. And I wanted to deliver a message. So if you'll bear with me, I'm recording myself deliver this message so I can give it to my grandson so 20 years from now he can. All right. So Dr. King talked about that life needs to be lived in 3 dimensions. When Dr. King gave this message 48 years ago, they didn't have 3D movies like we've got nowadays. We can go to the movies, we put on those funny glasses, and we look at the movie screen, and you can see the movie in 3 dimensions where everything comes at you. And Dr. King talked about our lives, if it's a balanced, if it's a what he called a complete life, we need to live in 3 dimensions. And he talked about the fact that there was this man named John. And he was imprisoned on an island, a remote island called Patmos. And Dr. King talked about how he'd been in prison some. And he said, when you're in prison, you don't have much to do except think. And think about your life and about where you've been and where you're going. And this man named John on Patmos wrote in Revelations about this city coming down from heaven to earth. This city of God where we're going to dwell with God. And in chapter 10, he talks about when this city comes down, this city, this new Jerusalem comes down from heaven, it's going to be equal in its length and in its breadth and in its height. And that there's symbolism in the completeness of the city of God being equal in the length, in the breadth, in the height that applies to our lives. And so the idea is that our lives need to be equally focused on the length and the breadth and the height. So what did Dr. King mean by that? Well, first, on the length of our lives, he talked about that we need a healthy self-interest in our own welfare. Amen. We need to have a good feeling about ourselves. And the second, on the breadth of life, is a outward concern for others. In the breadth of life, we need to be concerned about other people's welfare than just our own. And then on the last, the height of life, that we need to reach up for Almighty God. We don't need to just be looking out after each other and ourselves. We need to reach up to God to have a complete life. So it starts with the length of life. And the idea is to have a effective dimension of a length of life that we need to love ourselves before we can love each other. Amen. And in society today, I especially think about the young people, we get so many negative feedback about ourselves. I raised 3 daughters. There was a lot of negative feedback about them, about their bodies, about their hair, about their fingernails, about everything. You know, a lot of images that made them think that they didn't fit in. Men, it's the same way, except we're more want to look like football players or something like that. And so we have images that we're too weak and we're not strong enough in life. And Dr. King talks about a book that was written by a rabbi named Lieberman. And in that book, there's a chapter called Loving Thyself Properly. That we need to love ourselves properly so we can go out and love others. And the idea is that we need to realize that we are children of God. We're made in God's image. That's a powerful concept, that we're made in God's image. That we must not be junk because we're like God in that God made us. And in addition to having a good self-image, though, we need to have a realistic self-image. We're not all going to be presidents and senators and on TV and different things like that. We need to realize the tools that God's given us. You know, I realized that I had limitations back when I was in junior in high school. I was on the football team. Choir's heard this. I was on the football team and we had the spring game. And that's where they divide the team in half and you play each other. We had the green versus the white at King High School. And so my parents came and they were in the stadium and we were going to have this big practice game. And we played the game. I was the only football player on the whole team that didn't play in the spring game. My dad went up afterwards and said, "What happened, son? How come you didn't play?" And you know, I realized that night that God had not made me a football player. I wasn't going to be a football player. As much as I dreamed about it, as much as I read all the magazines about it, I wasn't going to be a football player. I was going to be something else. And we all need to look at where we are in our lives and what we're doing. And Dr. King talks about being the best that you can be at whatever you're doing. There was a young man that went to our church that I got to know, and he went to university out here. When he graduated from the university, he went to work at Starbucks serving coffee. And I'm sure he was kind of disappointed after his university degree that he was making coffee for people and serving it. His name was Joseph Galan. Joseph Galan was the best coffee maker there was at Starbucks. He really was. He was good. And people gravitated toward Joseph. And Joseph became so good at working at Starbucks that people who had companies came in and said, "Hey, would you ever think about working for me?" Because they saw the talent in this young man. He got offered a job at Susser, the convenience stores, and he ultimately is now a pharmaceutical salesman. And it all started with him making coffee at Starbucks. And he really was the best at that. So whatever we do, we need to do our best. whatever job we have, whether, as Dr. King said, whether we're sweeping the streets or we're in the Capitol, we need to do the best job that we can do. The second part, the second dimension of our life is the breadth of life. That is an outward concern for the welfare of other people. You know, a lot of people don't get past that first aspect of life. They are centered on themselves and what they can do. They only make relationships if the relationship will help them in their lives. Dr. King called it a utilitarian friendships, that you get friends who you need to pull you up to the next ladder. But we don't need to be doing that. We need to be making friends and looking out for the welfare of others because we're genuinely interested in them. There's a parable that Jesus told called the Good Samaritan. In the parable of Good Samaritan, y'all all know it, the man got robbed and beaten up and was laying beside the road, and the priest and the Levite passed on by on the other side of the road. And a man of another race stopped and helped him out. And there's a bunch of different theories on why the priest and the Levite crossed to the other side of the road and didn't stop. One theory is that they were late for church. They were going to church and they really didn't have time. It was supposed to start pretty soon, so they didn't have time to stop and help this man because they'd be late for church. Another theory is that they were supposed to do the sacraments and they couldn't touch a dead body beside the road. So they couldn't stop and help this man for fear that he had died, and that would make it where they couldn't do the sacraments, so that was a reason. Another theory is that they were on the way to a Jericho Road improvement meeting where they were going to deal with this issue of this Jericho Road being so dangerous, and they really needed to get to that meeting so they could figure out a way so nobody else would be like this, but they didn't have time to help this man that was beside the road. Dr. King said, I feel that it's fear was the reason those men didn't stop. They were concerned for their own safety. They were concerned that they would end up like that man beside the road if they stopped. I don't know if any of y'all ever been in a place where you were afraid of your own safety when you were on a road. I know my daughters, they like to scare each other. And one of the ways they would scare each other, when they got a little bit older and they could drive, there's a road off by Weber called Saluki Road. And the rumor was that it was haunted on Saluki Road. So late at night, about the time my wife and I were going to bed, they would get in the car and they'd go over to Saluki Road to scare themselves. And I think even one time they saw some drug people with big pit bull dogs over there and got scared and came back home. And they like to intentionally scare themselves. I don't know why they do that, but I probably should have stopped them, shouldn't I? But we all have our fears. We all have our fears on why we don't stop and help, on why we don't do things for other people. And when Jesus told this story of the Good Samaritan, what he said is that the Samaritan, instead of looking at it as what's going to happen to me if I stop, he thought, what's going to happen to this man if I don't stop? And that's the whole message of the Good Samaritan story is, it's not about what's going to happen to us. It's like, what is going to happen to this person who's lonely if I don't go by and check on them? What's going to happen on this person who may not have some food to eat if I don't give them some food to eat? What's going to happen on this person that doesn't have enough money to get by through the month if I don't help them? That's the message of the Good Samaritan. I don't know if y'all are going to play this song, When the Saints Go Marching In. Y'all played it at the last service. But when we go marching in as the saints, God's not going to ask us what kind of car you drove. He's not going to ask us how beautiful was your house. He's not going to ask us how much money did you have in the bank. What he's going to ask you is, I was hungry. Did you give me something to eat?
Yeah.
I was thirsty. Did you give me a drink? I was broke. Did you give me some money? That's what he's going to ask. Now, the third dimension of life is called the height of life. And that's an upward reach for the Almighty God. Now, a lot of people don't get beyond the first two. They're concerned about themselves, and sometimes they're even concerned about others. But a lot of people don't encounter God in their lives. Dr. King talks about two kinds of atheism. He said one kind of atheism is where you have theoretical atheism, where you think about whether you believe in God. And you reason through it, and you listen to debates, and you decide that you don't believe in God. That's pretty rare for somebody that does that. But he talks about a practical atheism where you live your life as if there is no God. Don't we do that sometimes? Doesn't society do that? Live as if there is no God. There was a movie, and I don't know if y'all saw this movie. It was called God Is Not Dead. And it was a Christian movie that was out, and I'll probably be watching the Oscars tonight. I'm kind of a movie critic. It was a terrible movie. They really did not act it very well. But it had a good message. And the message of the movie was there was a young man that was going to college, and he was taking a philosophy class. And the professor required them, for 1/3 of their grade, to write on a piece of paper, God is dead. Some people got out and walked out of the class when he did that, but most of the students, they wanted to get an A, so they wrote on a piece of paper, God is dead. And they turned it in. And there was this one guy who he was probably a cradle member like Zach over here, and he said, I'm not writing on a piece of paper that God's dead. God's not dead.